Generals gathered in blood masses, just like witches said black masters. Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death construction. In the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning. Death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord. Hey, hey, hey. Yeah.
את הנרות ידליקו מ"פים בתקף שנפצעו, לא ויתרו וחזרו ללחימה. שומינוב, גולן קריגר ושטראובר, אתם דוגמה עבור כולנו, אנחנו אוהבים אתכם וגאים בכם. לכל מדינת ישראל, חג שמח.
Taking place all across LA and across the country as Jews continue to raise their voices for a ceasefire. Again, that is from a statement released by that group involved.
Hello, this is a video about Hanukkah. You may of course notice that it is not Hanukkah time. We're about a month later than that. So why release this video now? Well, sometimes we start projects during Hanukkah and then life gets in the way. I think you'll find though that the themes that we discuss in this video are present throughout the year. And who knows, maybe you're listening to this from a future Hanukkah season where we have flying cars and world peace. But also, sometimes people are so wrong about something that you need to just make an hour-long video to discuss why they're wrong about it. Anyway, I hope you're doing well. I will be saying hello to you again in 3, 2. Hello. Hello. At time of recording, it is the last night of Hanukkah, 5784. I and millions of Jews around the world are bittersweetly lighting the 8th and final candle as the holiday comes to a close. But why? No, really, why? And especially this year, why? I mean, why am I doing it? Why am I wearing a keffiyeh and supporting Palestinians and celebrating such a Zionist holiday? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about just how much this holiday is or isn't really that Zionist. In the hierarchy of Jewish holidays from least to most important, Hanukkah technically comes very, very, very low on the list. The Book of Maccabees isn't even a Jewish sacred text. And the holiday itself is barely mentioned in the texts that are sacred. It's barely mentioned in the Talmud. There are a few major reasons why Hanukkah has become so popular in the last couple of centuries. As some European Jews were assimilating more and more, Hanukkah kind of grew up with Christmas, beginning during the Enlightenment, but then speeding up a lot during the Industrial Revolution. It's also very much interlinked with the consumerism and the commercialization of the holiday season itself. Another reason is that Hanukkah is a show of pride and resistance. One of the things that we are supposed to do during Hanukkah is display our menorahs very proudly in the window and say, yes, I'm a Jew and I'm here. But there's another reason why this holiday became really widely celebrated. And this reason has also had the most impact on how we look at the story and the meaning of the holiday itself, and in some ways, how we look at God. Of course, I'm talking about Zionism. As I'm sitting here right now, at least 18,000 people have been killed in Gaza. Again, almost half of them children. The attacks on refugee camps and schools have resumed. One especially noxious moment in the last few days was the attack on a theater company that helps children play and heal at least a little bit from the trauma that they're experiencing every day. And that wasn't even in Gaza. Remember, people are being attacked in the West Bank too. In the last few days, torrential rain has filled the ground with floods, spreading diseases as wave upon wave of unfathomable horrors crashes onto the Palestinian people. And in the midst of all of this, IDF soldiers raised an enormous menorah on top of the rubble. This is where you can already see a little bit of the twist. The original meaning of showing that we're proud to be here in the face of oppression, of everything that we've experienced as Jews, has changed into being proud to be there after oppressing somebody else. Hanukkah is really important to the mythology of Zionism. When I posted about an event I was doing with some fellow anti-Zionist Jews, I was really fascinated to see that I maybe got more backlash there than like any other post that I've made in the last couple of months. You know about the origin of Hanukkah, right? I don't think this holiday aligns with your anti-Zionism. And because I love raw data, I responded to this by asking a number of questions. What do you believe the meaning of Hanukkah is? Because I am genuinely curious. User YOWEG says, pathetic response. Hanukkah celebrates our roots in Israel and the Hasmonean dynasty's defeat of an enemy that wanted to erase our ideology in Judea. If you aren't a Zionist, don't bother lighting a menorah tonight. Then someone said, first of all, Hanukkah doesn't have a meaning. It's actual history. It's not a religious holiday. You do know that, right? It's literally a Zionist holiday. We celebrate it to remember the revolt against the Seleucid Empire. So yeah, full-on Zionist. That one almost reads like a joke, but I think that they're serious. Hanukkah is a Zionist holiday. Sorry to break it to you. Oh, where are you trying to go? Where are you trying to go, Pikachu? There's fire here. I don't like that. Okay. How can a holiday that is thousands of years old be Zionist when political Zionism didn't exist until the late 1800s? Oh, yeah, Pikachu, that's fire. You had to find out the hard way. I'm sorry, buddy. There's no way I could have communicated that to you. So let's get into how political Zionism, the idea that human beings should manufacture a mass return of all Jews to Israel, literally changed the way that we look at and understand Hanukkah. For all of the Goyim out there, thank you for watching, by the way, I'll tell you real quick what happened. We're going to start with this Truth Out article by Rabbi Elliot Kukla. In 167 BCE, in occupied Jerusalem, there was a Jewish uprising against the repression of the Hellenist Seleucid Empire, led by a group of rebels known as the Maccabees, literally the Hammers. Miraculously, the ragtag group of radicals won against one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. This is the miracle that dominates the modern retellings of Hanukkah, the marvel of resistance. We're gonna get to the oil part and why we have these beautiful menorahs here at all in a bit, but that doesn't come until later and isn't a part of the historical fact. Everything else, as far as we know, really happened. It's basically understood that at that point, King Antiochus was not allowing Jews in that region to practice their religion, which was kind of like an escalation of oppression over the last few years. So that's something to keep in mind. But now we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty. To do that, we're gonna look at this lovely article, which is called The Inconvenient Zionism of Hanukkah. It is by a writer called Michael Starr, who appears to be very excited to be on the front lines right now. He did get ratioed pretty hard, but that's probably not stopping him. We should note that he is not a rabbi. The Maccabees rebelled against the suppression of their peoplehood. So far, so good. They fought the Seleucid Empire and were able to take back Jerusalem for themselves. Modern Zionists are the successors to the Maccabees. They want a refuge to quietly enjoy their nation, heritage, and culture where foreign powers cannot suppress them. That word quietly, obviously, is doing a lot of work here, but we have bigger fish to fry. Only they can be entrusted to secure their own future, to have self-determination in their historic homeland, like the Maccabees before that. Once the temple was secure, so once they recaptured the temple and cleaned it up, the Jewish resistance went to establish an independent kingdom of Israel. Okay, here's where we're gonna start to run into some problems. The first thing we have to understand is that the Maccabean revolt is a tiny bit like the Les Mis of Jewish stories, specifically in that it's not a successful revolution. At least it wasn't successful yet. By decades. A military genius, Judas the Maccabee, beat back the Greek armies, recaptured Jerusalem, and rededicated the temple. But he was ultimately defeated in 160 BCE by the Seleucids, and he was killed. So this family that made up the Maccabees, by the next generation, they were called the Hasmoneans. And it was only then, in 140 BCE, 20 years later, that they sort of basically ruled over Judea. And let me tell you, it was a rocky time. Very rocky. Rocky road ice cream. When I say basically, I mean that between 140 and 116 BCE, they were semi-autonomous, like a client state of the Seleucid Empire. So sort of self-rule, sort of not, but that maybe is neither here nor there. We have, again, even bigger fish to fry. The Hasmoneans, these rulers, renamed themselves with Greek names. And this may be a little surprising if you know the real reason behind why the Maccabees were revolting. One way to look at the Maccabean revolt is not simply as a revolt in itself, but also kind of a civil war. A lot of the time, they were fighting against other Jews. The Maccabees weren't simply angry because there was less opportunity or you weren't allowed to fully practice Jewish religion. They were even more angry at the Jews that they saw as assimilating into Greek culture or Hellenistic culture. Jews that took on Greek names, maybe stopped getting circumcised, were a little bit more loosey-goosey with the rules. They had a very specific idea, though, about what Jews were or were supposed to be like. A lot of people today will draw a comparison between more rural people that are more religious, being like the Maccabees, and more urban living people in the city who drink oat milk and maybe have different pronouns, Hellenizing Jews. None of these things actually make that much sense in real life, but this is just how it is explained sometimes or talked about. And so because the Maccabees are supposed to be the cool guys, it'll be like a diss that Zionists like to throw at anti-Zionist Jews. You guys are being so like the Greeks right now, or you are being so like those Hellenized Jews in 167 BCE. You're not like those strong Jews. They don't drink oat milk, they drink real milk. Very hairy, tough, manly men. The Neo-Hellenist Jews refuse to take responsibility for their own future. What I want to highlight here is really just how violent the Maccabees were towards the Hellenizing Jews. When Jews were browbeaten into making offerings to Greek gods, Judah Maccabee's father, Mattathias, sprang into action. His first target was a fellow Jew. So the first target in the entire Maccabean revolt, a Jew. As recounted in the book of Maccabees, when Mattathias saw the Jew offer a sacrifice, he was filled with zeal. His heart was moved and his just fury was aroused. He sprang forward and killed him upon the altar. The Hellenized Jews subsequently found themselves terrorized by Mattathias and his followers. Those seen as insufficiently loyal to Jewish law were targeted for attack in what can only be described as sectarian violence. As the first book of Maccabees continues, they gathered an army and struck down sinners in their anger and lawbreakers in their wrath. And the survivors fled to the Gentiles for safety. Mattathias and his friends went around town and tore down the pagan altars. They also enforced circumcision for any uncircumcised boys whom they found in the territory of Israel. They put to flight the arrogant, and the work prospered in their hands. In fact, from 160 to 153 BCE, the Maccabees actually avoided direct conflict with the Seleucids, but instead focused on internal Jewish civil struggle. The rebels harassed, exiled, and killed Jews seen as insufficiently anti-Greek. But strangely, by the time the Hasmoneans do come into power, they become fairly Hellenist themselves, and they gave themselves names to match. John Hyrcanus I, Aristobulus I, who termed himself a Philhellene, or a devotee of Greek culture. Myth number 2: they were great Jews. Hint: the Hasmoneans were not so great at being Jews. The Maccabeans' descendants the Hasmonean dynasty, routinely violated their own Jewish law and tradition. But don't take it from me, take it from myjewishlearning.com. In fact, taking control of the kingship in the way that they did violated the people's trust because it transgressed the Torah. The kingship was supposed to reside in the tribe of Yehuda, and Hasmoneans were in the tribe of Levi, so they technically weren't in line for priesthood or political leadership, but they ignored that because they wanted to rule. But far more importantly than them not being good Jews, they were just not good people, okay? I'm not sure if that is a myth that they were good people, but they certainly are looked at as heroes, and there's really the closer you look, there's not much heroic about them. The Hasmonean state was governed by Halacha. The high priest in the temple was also the supreme military commander, and the boundaries between religion, state, and army disappeared entirely. The Hasmoneans conquered more and more territories in the land, Judaized it by sword, meaning that they converted their neighbors to Judaism by coercion. This may be the only time in history that people are forcibly converted into Judaism. And what's especially wild is that it happened here en masse. It's contradictory to the very nature of Judaism itself. They formed a mercenary army, which, for all we know, they thought of as the world's most moral army. John ruled from 134 to 104 BCE, circumcised hundreds of thousands of Edomites by force. Alexander Eunaeus, one of his successors, massacred hundreds of Jews, followers of the Pharisees, the representatives and the shapers of Judaism, as we know it today. He determined that he was above all forms of law and razed every city whose inhabitants refused to convert. Here are some more. Aristobulus and Hyrcanus II were full-fledged despots who enslaved citizens and committed acts of murder left and right. They brought about the financial decline of the Hasmonean state, in which moral degradation and internecine conflicts spread like cancerous growths until it fell like a ripe fruit into the hands of the Romans. Whew, she was writing. Not only were they not nice people, but also they were bad at their job. What began in glory ended in ignominy. Ignominy?
Ignominy.
Ignominy. Ignominy. Ignominy. The 9 Hasmonean rulers, to be recognized by the Roman Senate, engaged in the same political intrigues, I can't do this. Oh my God. I'm usually better at this.
You're tired.
I know. Self-aggrandizement, aggrandizement, and bloodshed as the previous regime. When 2 brothers who were not eligible claimed the kingship, they called on a representative of Rome to arbitrate. Foolishly repeating the mistake of the Hellenized Jews, the contending brothers opened the door to the Roman conquest, which ended their rule. And then Herod came and killed the last of them after just 103 years and ended Jewish sovereignty in Israel for the next 2,000 years. But here's where things get important, so pay attention to this. A few decades later, Jews in the area who were being oppressed by the Romans would attempt to do another revolt, another revolution, in the style of the Maccabees. And it failed. It did not work. I mean, it really didn't work. The Great Revolt of 70 CE led to the destruction of the Second Temple, the very center of Jewish life and religion at the time. This destruction of this temple is often seen as one of the main events that led to Jews leaving this land and becoming a diaspora around the world, and the religion and way of life changing completely. And again, just to add some gravity to this, it is often seen as one of the greatest tragedies in Jewish history. Then, in 135 AD, another revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt. A guy who thought he was the Messiah attempted to lead a revolution that ended in great defeat involving unprecedented human loss and property destruction among the Jews. So in the centuries following this, the rabbis are the ones who are starting to come to the fore as the spiritual, intellectual, etc. leaders of the Jewish people. And this is now where we're finally going to get to these things before the candles go out, hopefully. It is in the 6th century CE, in about 500, where the rabbis added the tale of the oil lasting for 8 nights. The enormous defeats from these revolutions are all very fresh in their mind. War no longer seemed like an effective solution to the Jews' tribulations on the stage of history. A new ideology de-emphasized the idea that Jews should or could change their destiny through military action. What was required, the rabbis asserted, was not battle, but perfect observance of God's moral and ritual law. This would lead to God's intervention in history to restore the Jewish people's control over their land and destiny. In this context, the rabbis rethought Hanukkah. They rethought its origins as a celebration of military victory. Instead, they said Hanukkah should be seen as commemorating a miracle that occurred during the Maccabees' rededication of the temple. They introduced a story where the Maccabees really needed a jar of oil. The jar of temple oil that they found was sufficient only for 1 day, but by a miracle, it sustained the temple's eternal lamp for 8 full days. The actual books of Maccabees, Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2, which tell the story of the rebellion, became a holy text in Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christian traditions. But again, it's never been a Jewish sacred text. One rabbi that I talked to before making this video, who I'm going to refer to as Rabbi R, actually talks about this part of the Talmud being a polemic against the Maccabees, a polemic against what they saw as a perversion of religious piety or purism, which is interesting because this might get into the nitty-gritty, but the rabbis were connected to the Pharisees. Remember, the Hasmoneans didn't really like the Pharisees and they were kind of oppressing them. But these are also, interestingly, kind of two divergent forms of the idea of what it means to be a good Jew. One is this kind of very purist sort of notion that does include a lot of military might. The more rabbinic way is something that's a little bit more, well, it becomes a lot more peaceful. The idea is we're not going to be saved through military prowess, through being really mighty and violent. We're going to save ourselves through being better Jews, through our covenant with God. You might look at it in a way as being, okay, we're gonna be maybe even better people. Maybe we'll do some solidarity with our fellow neighbors and we could protect ourselves that way. A thought, an idea. Maybe this was a hint at some of that. One story I really love, and I think this is so weird and interesting. One of the epithets for the people of Israel in the Bible is Tola'at Yaakov, or the worm of Jacob. The Midrash grasped this surprising and peculiar image as a comparison with a worm, as it eats away at a large cedar and brings it down. As with the worm, the power of the people of Israel lies only in the mouth, in prayer and study. Anyone who enters a Beit Midrash, a Jewish study hall, observes the people in it and understands how far the military way of life is from the way of yeshiva students, the way that they stand, walk, shake hands, and speak. In the last video, we talked a lot about the power of words, just how central the Hebrew language, but just also words and language in general is to so much Jewish culture. But I also just love this image of a worm taking down an empire. I love this. I love this. I love this image. It relates to something I've been thinking about a lot that I don't know how to phrase because I don't want it to sound weird, because it already sounds weird, right? But it's also so great. Rabbi Mike Rothbaum continues, "It is little wonder that when it came time to discuss Hanukkah in the Talmud, the rabbis changed the narrative. Given the benefit of hindsight, the rabbis saw the Hasmonean dynasty became brutal and cruel. Born in violence, it became addicted to violence." So when you say that Hanukkah is not a religious holiday, you are really rejecting everything that the rabbis warned about and taught about for thousands of years. And something that I think is the most core to our tradition and the most beautiful part of this holiday. Not the violence and the bloodshed, but the miracle that we're still here despite everything that people have done to us or tried to do to us. Of course, the miracle of the oil is the thing that didn't happen. And the Maccabees really did exist and did all of those things. But I don't know. I find that the story of the oil is the more true one. At least something that is more true to the core of Jewish existence. Okay, it's midnight. My candles are almost out. It's the end of Hanukkah, and I'm gonna go to bed. We'll continue on very soon. Okay, good night. I will make it work. Yeah. Good evening. Good evening. Looking at the camera. Hello, camera. This week, we've been moving all week. We were moving all week last week, but then we're really moving all week this week. So there are boxes behind me and not that many decorative objects. We got a Hulk hand. We have a mini trolley car. The crazy thing about Hanukkah is, even though it has changed a lot over the years, is that it really has also remained the same. Ancient Jewish historian Titus Flavius Josephus, somehow that's a funny name. I'm sorry. It's like it shouldn't exist. Titus Flavius Josephus wrote that Judas Maccabeus ordered that there be 8-day festivities yearly to celebrate the recapturing of the temple, where apparently they omitted no sort of pleasures, in that they kept in all the pleasures. One day we'll get into how Judaism is an incredibly tactile religion / way of life. It has something to do with my tattoo, by the way. But pleasure and joy has always been especially important part of Shabbat or Shabbos, but also certain holidays. And 2 of those holidays are Hanukkah and Purim. In fact, the Megillat Tanit, the book of fasting, specifically lists Hanukkah as 8 days where you are not allowed to fast. Even if you want to do extra fasting, you're not allowed to do it on Hanukkah. But this is one of the very few times that Hanukkah is mentioned at all in Jewish sacred texts. It would be fascinating, of course, to go over all of them. There are legal battles between whether it is more important to have a Hanukkah or Shabbat candle holders, for example. But I think what's most interesting is that even when it is mentioned, there are generally very scant details describing how Hanukkah is supposed to be celebrated, especially in those earlier texts in the 1st and 2nd centuries. But this does not mean that Hanukkah wasn't being celebrated. In fact, it means the exact opposite. It was being celebrated, it was happening. People just knew how to do it anyway. They didn't need instructions for this particular holiday, or at least that's what some people say. Hanukkah, in this way, I feel like is kind of a folk holiday, or at least it's highly folky, which also means that it is particularly given to fluctuation, changes, and especially changes depending on where it is in time and where it is in location, where people are celebrating it. For example, it's quite possible that the rabbis writing in the Talmud around the year 500, when the story of the oil lasting for 8 days actually comes up for the first time, is that they didn't make up that story like on the spot. It was already a folk legend. It was already a part of the zeitgeist. And so they just kind of solidified that legend into the story of Hanukkah and what we should focus on when we celebrate this holiday. Here are a couple unique ways that Hanukkah has been celebrated around the world. Jews in Romania, as well as Austria and some other Central European communities, would scrape out potatoes, filling each potato with oil and a wick to serve as a menorah. Rather than putting all 8 out at once, each day they would add another potato. The origin of this custom is unclear, but it likely came about due to economic struggles. In Morocco, Algeria, North African communities, it is customary not to put the menorah in a window, but to hang it on a doorway beside the mezuzah. Putting the menorah near the mezuzah was thought to enhance the protection offered by the mezuzah. If you look at menorahs made in North Africa, you will notice that many have a ring at the top, as well as a flat metal backing so that the menorah could be safely hung. Here's one of my favorites though. The region of Avignon, located in southern France, is renowned for its wineries. During the Saturday night that falls during Hanukkah after Shabbat ended,
the Jews of Avignon opened a new bottle of local wine in their homes to make a toast. Then each family travels around their neighborhood to taste the wines chosen by their neighbors and to toast the miracle of Hanukkah. Hanukkah wine tastings. Mwah! The reason I bring up all of these points is that Hanukkah, I think, more than any other holiday I've looked at so far, is particularly representative of the area where Jews settled. This is why I often like to say there is no one Jewish culture. That is kind of true. But there are many, many, many diverse Jewish cultures with absolutely strong ties in between them. This next tradition I started talking about a little bit, but I realized that Hadar Cohen is the perfect person to talk about this and made an incredible video about it before, so here it is now.
I want to share a Syrian Jewish Hanukkah tradition, which is to light an additional 9th candle each night of Hanukkah. And the reason Syrian Jews would light an additional candle is because in 1492, Spain expelled its Jewish population, and these Sephardic Jews were displaced and they were welcomed all over the Ottoman Empire, from Alexandria to Istanbul to Aleppo. And this is my personal family history and lineage. We were expelled from Spain and we came to Aleppo. And the Syrian people would accept the Jewish community and they would welcome them in. So this is why Syrian Jews would light an additional candle to honor and acknowledge the light of Syria, of its people, of the land that welcomed them in. And I love this because it really dismantles this current narrative that there's this war between Jews and Muslims, or Jews and Arabs, or Jews and Palestinians, which that really erases our shared history. So my ritual this year for Hanukkah will include lighting an extra candle for Palestine and for the Palestinian people, for their suffering and their oppression, and also for their liberation. And I invite you to join me in that practice and ritual if you'd like. May our shared history of love and solidarity become our shared future.
One of the beautiful things about Judaism, about our diaspora, is that it reflects all of the beauty of the world, of the places that we went. And yes, of course, there were struggles everywhere, and oppression and death and misery. That's a huge part of what all of our holidays are about, or almost all of our holidays, is reconciling with and dealing with that trauma. One of the most beautiful ways to look at this diversity is to look at Hanukkah menorahs themselves, which often, like a lot of other Jewish ritual objects, represent the architecture that was in the area in which we were settling and living. There are a lot of Jewish customs, of course, that go back thousands of years. Others were solidified more or less in the Middle Ages. But there are some customs that were common in the Middle Ages that, sadly, to me, are not as common now. And a couple of those customs were during Hanukkah, particularly eating salty cheese and celebrating a woman who chops off the head of a very evil man. Yes, it used to be extremely common, not so much to focus on the Maccabees during Hanukkah, but instead to focus on Judith. Judith's story starts in Jerusalem a few hundred years before Judah's story and the Maccabean revolt. The reason we used to celebrate Judith a lot during Hanukkah is that she was apparently a part of the Maccabee family, but also because of her heroism at a time when Jews were being oppressed. In a nutshell, the Jews are being especially oppressed by the evil Holofernes and his armies, who were sent by King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. Judith is kind of a wealthy widow and realizes that she has an inn. A widow of 3 years, she had been in deep mourning, only wearing rags and ashes. And her children were on the brink of starvation, as her city is under siege by the evil Holofernes and his armies, who had been sent by King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonian Empire to conquer the cities and convert the Jews living there. Determined her city will not fall, she devises a plan that convinces her people that she can single-handedly defeat their enemies. She takes off her mourning clothes and puts on her finest velvets and jewels and beautiful fabrics. She's just really gorgeous, okay? She goes to Holofernes' tent and she brings wine and salty cheese. and she tempts him with the wine and the salty cheese snacks. And because the cheese is salty, it absorbs all of the wine. And she's also like being super sexy and maybe hinting like, maybe you can get with me. But he doesn't, because Holofernes falls asleep because he drinks so much wine absorbed by his body because the cheese is so salty. Long story short, she chops off his head and gathers it up with her handmaiden, goes back to her people, and the army flees. She has thus single-handedly, with her womanly ways and salty cheese, saved the Jewish people. Food historian Susan Weingarten says that by the 14th century, there was quite a strong tradition that people eat cheese on Hanukkah, and it's associated with Judith giving cheese to the enemy to make him drunk. Jews in Italy would make fried ricotta as a Hanukkah treat. Specifically, fried ricotta pancakes, which sound really fucking good. Apparently, there are some Jewish communities, particularly Orthodox families, who continue to make fried ricotta pancakes in Italy for Hanukkah. It was only in the 16th century that potatoes were brought to Europe, and only in the 1800s where they were actually widely cultivated across the continent. That is when Jewish populations began shredding them, frying them in schmaltz, not oil, because they didn't have oil yet, and eating them as a Hanukkah treat. That latke actually evolved from the fried ricotta pancake in Rome. Eventually, the cheese became less important. The focus shifted a little bit back to the Maccabees. Why? There are a couple reasons. But first, I do think that we're missing a little bit of a link between fried ricotta pancakes and potato latkes. My personal opinion is that that missing link is Central and Eastern European food in general, which really latched onto the potato, giving us the division between potato Europe and tomato Europe. By the 1800s, potatoes were getting super popular, and in Germany, you began to see Kartoffelpuffer, or German potato pancakes, which are incredibly similar to latkes. Matzo ball soup is also incredibly similar to Reisklochchen. Gleisklochchen. Hanukkah geld is incredibly similar to Schokogoldmutzen. Dreidels, which come from the word dreidel, I think, something like that, which means to spin or to turn, are incredibly similar to a teetotum or the trundle. All of these wonderful Hanukkah traditions do have similarities with many Central and Eastern European traditions as well. Because we were trading with our neighbors, we weren't isolated all by ourselves all the time. And that's not just okay, that's a good thing. That's more than a good thing, it's a great thing. One more is sufganiyot, which are beautiful little donuts filled with jelly that are often referred to as being Israeli. They were brought to Israel by Polish immigrants who were bringing with them a Central/Eastern European recipe. Who came up with these recipes first? I don't know, and it honestly doesn't matter. This isn't to say anybody stole anything from anybody, but really that we were and still are super ingrained in these communities and cultures in a way that should be recognized as absolutely wonderful. Of course, there are even more Hanukkah traditions that are quite similar to Christmas, that go back quite a long way, not just when Jews came to America. In Eastern Europe, Hanukkah developed into a celebration with special emphasis on children. Children were given Hanukkah geld, small sums of money collected from the adult members of the family, as well as gifts. Despite what many believe, Jews have lived along other cultures for millennia. There is no one pure Jewish culture, and it would be folly to try and create one. Right? But do we just not celebrate Judith anymore because we decided we liked latkes better than fried ricotta pancakes? I've never had a fried ricotta pancake, so I wouldn't know. And latkes certainly are delicious, but no, that's not why. There are probably a few reasons, but one major reason is Zionism. Of course, it was only with the rise of Zionism in the 19th century that the Maccabees were revived as the heroes of the Hanukkah story. Again, remember, the rabbis in the Talmud really, some might say, even discouraged the idea that the Maccabees should be heroes at all. And that's why it was not the extremely religious Jews that wanted the Maccabees to be the heroes again, but rather the largely visibly assimilated Jews that were more attracted to Zionism. At this point, Jews in Central Europe who had begun to appear just like any other person on the street, they didn't look like the Orthodox Jews coming from farther east. Throughout the 1800s, this was really helpful for gaining opportunities for work, reaching higher in society in general, because, anti-Semitism. However, by the end of the century, they had reached the end of their rope. Why? Because of the introduction of scientific racism and biological determination. The idea that this race is better at this thing, this race is better at that other thing, the white race that's not Jewish is the best race, and if you're a Jew, if you're black, if you're any other race that we have determined on these very specific categories, you can never pretend to be something else. You are what that is. Jewishness was no longer seen as an attribute you could convert away from, but something that was genetic, a part of your core being, and you would be persecuted as such. So there were two roads. The first was the workers' movement, which often sought to fight anti-Semitism and oppression in the diaspora alongside fighting for workers' rights. The Bund is a really good example of this. Option number two, Zionism. This option is, we're never gonna make it here, we're not gonna be able to end anti-Semitism, we might as well get out and go to Israel. A lot of this early Zionist movement was generally spurred on by more highbrow, less visibly Jewish, a little bit wealthier, and maybe less religious people, depending on the situation. But it is specifically the reshaping of Hanukkah that is done by largely not so religious Jews. It became a holiday with a strong accent on national and military dimension. Hanukkah celebrations were markedly different from earlier Hanukkah celebrations that might have happened in the shtetl or with more traditional Jews. The shift was away from children and again more toward a sort of nationalistic bent. Often it would include speakers who had these really exciting speeches about all of the great things that would happen once they got to the Holy Land, once they got to Israel. And also exciting speeches about the Maccabees. One observer of a Jewish philanthropic event in 1887 noted with an acute expression of frustration that no Jewish music was played, although the evening took place on Maccabean's Eve. The Maccabees, how this word resounds. The crazy thought crossed my mind that I was in fact looking at the offspring of these Maccabees. There's no question that a lot of the commentary on these events seems to be slightly confused. It's definitely a time where this particular group is trying to figure out who they are and what they're all about. But I think what is important to note is that a lot of these events were kind of like these very highbrow adult salons where opera was being sung and these kind of new nationalist myths. And it was also these very early shreds of Hebraicist culture, reviving the Hebrew language. Again, remember too that this is during the period in Europe where nationalism is really becoming a thing. Germany has just become a country around 1870. So it's only natural that those that are more highbrow in the Jewish community are clinging onto this idea of nationalism and making a nation state. The other part of that quote that I think is fascinating is when he says how strange that word resounds, the Maccabees, in my throat. Meaning that this guy wasn't that familiar with the Maccabees before. Had he read Maccabees 1 and 2? Did he know all the things they did, how effective they were as leaders? Probably not. You start to see the building of this myth of this super strong man who is the Maccabee, a super oversimplified retelling of the Hanukkah story. It's at the Second Zionist Congress in 1898 where Max Nordau urged the shaping of a new muscular Jewry to master the land of Israel. Eventually, the Maccabee Games were introduced, an all-Jewish athletics tournament created to celebrate this new Jewish masculinity. So of course, we're not celebrating Judith anymore because she's a woman, but also because she does it all on her own. She's also not slaughtering lots of people, she just slaughters one guy. I mean, come on. And she doesn't take over the whole country in the way that the Maccabees did. Particularly after the Holocaust, Zionism looked high and low for episodes from Jewish history that would be appropriate for this image of the new Jew who took fate into his own hands. in order to erase from the collective memory the ostensibly flaccid character of the diaspora Jew with the shtetl aura who went like sheep to the slaughter. Again, as we talked about in the last video, this was really internalized anti-Semitism, really denigrating to Ashkenazi identity in general. Thus, the fighters of the so-called 1948 generation termed themselves the great-grandchildren of the Maccabees. And of course, Bibi himself comes onto the stage. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu makes a point in referring to the IDF soldiers as the new Maccabees. 2 years ago, he stated at a Hanukkah candle lighting ceremony, "I would remind all those who are trying to rewrite history today, the Maccabees were not the Palestinians. They were Jews, brothers, fighters. What heroism, what pride. And we, in the spirit of the Maccabees, are transforming Israel into a very strong country, a rising world force." Were the Maccabees? Are they worshipped as gods a little bit themselves? Maybe a little bit? Maybe without even meaning to, a little bit of idol worship kind of thing? The reason I even dare to say that is because there are a couple songs that kind of hint at that. Back to the article written by somebody who is not a rabbi. Critical review of post-diaspora revolutionary materials shows that the theology of post-diaspora movement this writing rests on two pillars: the rejection of Israel and Tikkun Olam. Just to be clear, Tikkun Olam is a central pillar, which means mending the world. It means doing things to make the world a better place. Another thing that these neo-Hellenists conceal is God. So there he goes again, by the way, calling Jews who are critical as Israel Greeks. It's so weird. One of the striking things about the neo-Hellenist post-diaspora propaganda is the absence of God. This is because Tikkun Olam has taken the top billing. In place of glorifying God in songs, prayers, and scriptures, instead are worshipped racial justice, monetary distribution, and popular social movements. Whatever one thinks of these ideas, they are not God. Worship of modern Tikkun Olam in this fashion is just placing the idol of Zeus in the temple. This is a man who just hates nice things. He just said that monetary redistribution and racial justice are not important. It's a great quote, bro. It's a really great quote. But not even is it just shitty, it's also super factually incorrect. It couldn't be farther from how Hanukkah by super pro-Israel people is actually observed or talked about. What we actually see is a direct rejection of what the rabbi said in the Talmud, the call to look to God instead of praising simply human endeavors, particularly human militaristic endeavors to conquer and oppress people and stuff like that. This is, I think, what led to that comment, Hanukkah isn't a religious holiday, which is bananas because it's a part of religion. But here's an illustration of what I'm talking about. Perhaps the most daring rejection of the traditions of Hanukkah in popular Israeli music is the song Anu Nosim Lapidim, We Are Carrying Torches, the lyrics to which were written by the poet Ze'ev. Sung to a marching beat, the song is an anthem of the self-sacrificing pioneers of modern Israel. We are carrying torches. In the dark night, the paths shine beneath our feet, and whoever has a heart that thirsts for the light, let him lift his eyes and his hearts to us and come along. No miracle happened for us. No cruse of oil did we find. We walked through the valley, ascended to the mountain. Other transvaluations are far from subtle. The lyrics of the popular Hanukkah song Mi Yamalel, or Who Can Recount, were written by one of the creators of Hebrew folk music in the early 20th century, Menashe Ravina. He begins by reworking the verse, Who can recount the mighty acts of the Lord, recite all of his praises, from Psalms 106:2 into this, Who can recount the mighty acts of the people Israel? Who can count them? In every generation a hero arises, redeemer of the people. Here, praise of God has yielded to praise of military victors, and the title of Redeemer, Goel, is now applied to a human rescuer, not a divine one. The traditional liturgy speaks of giving thanks for the miracles and the wonders which you performed for us in those days at this season. The lyrics of another song, Yamei HaHanukkah, written by Hebrew linguist and educator Avraham Avrunin, speak of the appreciation for the miracles and the wonders the Maccabees brought about. Literally saying that the Maccabees performed miracles, not God. I can't think of a better example of how God was taken out of Hanukkah. I'm actually not a very religious person, so taking God out of the holiday doesn't offend me on a religious level, technically. What is very irritating to me is, of course, number one, the oppression of Palestinian people, and number two, 1.2, the continued twisting and denial of Jewish history in order to oppress Palestinian people. And this is a prime example of it. Anti-Zionist Jews are not obscuring God in the holiday. We are bringing God back into it, observing what the rabbis actually wanted us to do in the Talmud, and the only place that Hanukkah is even mentioned in Jewish sacred texts. It is specifically Zionist mythology, as we have observed, that has taken God out of it and made it all about human militaristic endeavors, specifically ones that hurt innocent civilian people, as we are literally seeing right now. But what he says next, also, I don't know if I can decide if it's even more irritating or what. You decide. In JVP materials, they make repeated use of retelling the Hanukkah story in which they hold in disdain the holiday and the events that it celebrates. They describe the story as painful and complex, and the Maccabees as zealots attacking Jewish Hellenists. Now, that is exactly what the Maccabees were doing. In fact, some scholars say that the entire conflict started as a civil war, and Antiochus only came in to side with the Hellenists as a way to quell that war, after which the Maccabees rose up against him and recaptured the temple, lost it again, yada yada, created a despotic empire, da 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 da. So again, factually incorrect, but also the fact that he is whining, essentially ridiculing anti-Zionist Jews or Jews that are critical of Israel for something that is so core to Jewish practice and what the word Israel even means itself. The whole point is to wrestle with the text, to take things that are painful stories and fight with them, debate with each other. The entire Talmud itself, or at least, I don't know, a lot of it, is just rabbis fighting with each other, debating about what the answer is, how a certain law should be applied. One of the most important parts of Jewish belief is not knowing what to believe, being comfortable or welcoming in confusion. Which is why I do want to say that while I would love to just bring in Judith and forget all about the stupid Maccabees, I can't. And we can't. We can't forget about the terrible things in the past, even if we've done them ourselves or our very, very, very ancient ancestors. We have to deal with that. I know that Hanukkah this year was probably one of the most confusing, one of the most difficult for many, many Jews. Honestly, on all sides of this conflict. It is such a deep, confusing, terrible feeling to have this symbol on my table also being risen as a symbol of terrorism and oppression onto the Gazan people at the very same time. So whether we like it or not, I think we need to look at these more recent Hanukkah traditions, the focus on the Maccabees, and continue to tell that story. Don't just forget about it, but instead wrestle with it. Think about it deeply, how it's affected us, even if we've been critical of Israel our whole lives. There is still so much to be confused about. And again, that's part of the point. The very irony that a holiday that is supposed to be about resisting assimilation is one that is the most similar to other Christian holidays that are happening at the same time. But there's another reason for that too, and it's that Hanukkah comes from an even more ancient tradition, as does all Judaism and many other major religions. It's not a coincidence that we light lights near the solstice, near the darkest part of the year. Hanukkah is about staying proud, staying strong, even when we feel the most alone, when we feel our politicians have turned their backs on us, when we feel like the entire world is against us and against humanity itself, when it feels like we're just shouting into the wind our love for humanity and just getting punched in the face back. This is why we're meant to put the Hanukkah in the window or hang it on the doorway, to proclaim to the world that we are Jews, that we live this life no matter what. I know I've been feeling really afraid recently, and maybe selfishly so. I've been looking to these horrible images to Gaza, seeing how neatly it maps over Philadelphia, and thinking, there's one final part that really underlines and emphasizes, I think, exactly how these ancient sages wanted us to look at Hanukkah. When discussing Hanukkah in the Talmud, the rabbis chose Zechariah 2:14 to 4:7 as the Haftarah for the Shabbat in the middle of Hanukkah. The Haftarah is not just a half a Torah. It is on Shabbat and holiday mornings selections that are read from biblical books of the prophets. The story takes place in 537 BCE, so hundreds of years before the Maccabean revolt. Zechariah and fellow Jews are returning from Babylonian exile in the year 537 BCE, so hundreds of years before the Maccabean revolt. He encouraged his fellow Jews to rebuild the temple and restore the Jewish state. In a dream, the prophet saw a gold 7-branched candelabra flanked by 2 olive trees, which supplied oil through the boughs and pipes to the menorah. An angel reveals the dream's meaning with the words, "Not by might and not by power, but by my spirit," which alludes to God, the unseen power that fuels the menorah and makes possible both peace and the rebuilding of the temple. This is a very specific and pointed choice in what one of my rabbi friends calls an invective against the Maccabees. They are taking a really strong stand, saying that we're not going to try and use military power, to use violence and force through swords to rebuild the temple. If the temple is going to be rebuilt, if Israel is going to be our home again, it's going to happen through the grace of God and through peaceful means. Otherwise, we're going to bear the brunt of some pretty bloody results, as we're seeing right now. The IDF continues to literally defile our symbols and our religion, to purposefully misuse our history. Those who actually want to follow Hanukkah traditionally would see that, yes, there's lots of struggle to be had in the different ways it's been interpreted over time. But to me, there is no doubt that at the center of it, even with all of the messy, complicated questions of the diaspora, being Jews and living amongst other peoples who may hate us, that our survival will only come through love and cooperation with our neighbors, through solidarity. There shouldn't have been a real problem with returning to Israel. It should have been done through peaceful means, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says God. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's all I want to say. Yeah. All right, y'all. The last thing I want to share is the Christmas sermon from Reverend Munter Isaac, who is the Evangelical Lutheran Church minister in Bethlehem, in occupied Palestine. You may remember him from the Christ in the Rubble
crash scene. Well, here's some of the sermon to go with that. Of course, I encourage you to watch the rest of it. But he just said a few things better than I ever could. I felt like he had to have the final say on this. So yeah, I'm going to leave you with him, and I'll see you next time.
Christ under the rubble. We are angry. We are broken. This should have been a time of joy. Instead, we are mourning. We are fearful. More than 20,000 killed. Thousands are still under the rubble. Close to 9,000 children killed in the most brutal ways. Day after day, 1.9 million displaced, hundreds of thousands of homes destroyed. Gaza, as we know it, no longer exists. We are tormented by the silence of the world. Leaders of the so-called free lined up one after the other to give the green light for this genocide against a captive population. They gave the cover. Not only did they make sure to pay the bill in advance, they veiled the truth and context, providing the political cover. And yet another layer has been added, the theological cover, with the Western Church stepping into the spotlight. Our dear friends in South Africa taught us the concept of the state theology, defined as theology, the theological justification of the status quo with its racism, capitalism, and totalitarianism. It does so by misusing theological concepts and biblical texts for its own political purposes. Here in Palestine, the Bible is weaponized against us. Our very own sacred text. In our terminology in Palestine, we speak of the empire. Here we confront the theology of empire, a disguise for superiority, supremacy, chosenness, and entitlement. It is sometimes given a nice cover using words like mission and evangelism, fulfillment of prophecy, and spreading freedom and liberty. The theology of the empire becomes a powerful tool to mask oppression under the cloak of divine sanction. It speaks of land without people. It divides people into us and them. It dehumanizes and demonizes the concept of land without people again, even though they knew too well that the land had people, and not just any people, a very special people. Theology of the empire calls for emptying Gaza, just like it called for the ethnic cleansing in 1948, a miracle or a divine miracle as they called it. It calls for us Palestinians now to go to Egypt, maybe Jordan. Why not just the sea? I think of the words of the disciples to Jesus when he was about to enter Samaria. Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? They said of the Samaritans. This is the theology of the empire. This is what they're saying about us today. This war has confirmed to us that the world does not see us as equal. Maybe it's the color of our skins. Maybe it is because we are on the wrong side of a political equation. Even our kingship in Christ did not shield us. So they say, if it takes killing 100 Palestinians to get a single Hamas militant, then so be it. We are not humans in their eyes. But in God's eyes, no one can tell us that. So here is my message. Gaza today has become the moral compass of the world. Gaza was hell before October 7th, and the world was silent. Should we be surprised that they're silenced now? Jesus is under the rubble. This is his manger. He's at home with the marginalized, the suffering, the oppressed, and the displaced. This is his manger. We look and see him in every child killed and pulled from under the rubble. We look at the Holy Family and see them in every family displaced and wandering, now homeless in despair. While the world discusses the fate of the people of Gaza as if they are unwanted boxes in a garage, God in the Christmas narrative shares their fate. He walks with them and calls them his own. So this manger is about resilience. It's about sumud. And the resilience of Jesus is in his meekness, is in his weakness, is in his vulnerability. The majesty of the incarnation lies in its solidarity with the marginalized. Resilience because this is the very same child who rose up from the midst of pain, destruction, darkness, and death to challenge empires. This very same child accomplished this. This is Christmas today in Palestine. And this is the Christmas message. Stop this genocide now. Can you say it with me? Stop this genocide. Let's say it one more time. Stop this genocide. This is our call. This is our plea. This is our prayer. Hear, O God. Amen.
غرد يا بلبل عزتون بلادنا وغرد يا بلبل عزتون بلادنا جبل القفز نادى عجبل زيتون ايوه خلوا نار حب الوطن زيتون نحنا بالارض اغصان زيتون نحني بس لنبوس الترايب يا رايب الارض إلنا والبلاد بلادنا والارض